Okay, hi, my name is Frances, and I am trying to get information about the Johnson & Johnson fourth trial regarding the Pinnacle hip with metal liner. It's called the Ultamet. Basically, about 10,000 people filed suit related to their Pinnacle total hip replacement devices, claiming they were guinea pigs. And it's my guinea pig. And I have two of the hips, so that's how I got interested in this. And I've been frustrated because in prior Bellwether trials, there have been, well, this is the fourth, so there have been three others. No one's covering the trials, so I can't get information about the evidence presented. So then it makes it hard for me to decide what to do because I don't feel like I can get a straight answer from my doctor because I find out later that he's a Johnson and Johnson, which makes my hip, consultant or key opinion influencer or something like that. So I figured there were other people in a situation like I'm in right now and other people who would want to know what evidence is being presented at this trial and the other trials. So I live in Austin. The trial is in federal court happening in Dallas. So anyway, I could call this hearsay. I am finding out from someone who is in court every day what's happening in court and the evidence presented, and then I'm trying to do my best to relay that to you. So so let's just start. I'm talking about the first day of court, which would have been a week and a day ago, so about September 20th, which is a Wednesday, and now it's the 28th, Thursday. I'm finally getting around to conveying this. So these are New Jersey plaintiffs. Basically, 10,000 people sued Johnson & Johnson related to the Pinnacle hip with metal liner, claiming it's hurt them, it's caused a lot of trouble in their lives. Many of them have had to have revisions, which is when you take out the old hip replacement device and put in a new hip replacement device. Usually it's more complicated than getting a new hip. Dislocations, infections, things like that are more common in revision surgery. So 10,000 people, about 10,000 have sued so far, and the courts look at that and say, if we let you all go to trial, it'll clog up our court system. So they said, you guys are going to consolidate, and it's called a multi-district litigation thing. So these are the first couple trials to make it, first couple cases to make it to court, and they're coming, everyone filed individually, but they're being forced to go to trial in little groups of 5 or 6. So this involves plaintiffs only from New Jersey. They have 9 jurors, and they started with a Mr. Mark Lanier, who is the lead attorney for the plaintiffs. He's argued the past 3 cases, won the past 2 cases. They had verdicts go against Johnson and Johnson. I'll get into that later, maybe in another video. But this is about 6 people, Mark Lanier says in his opening statements. This is a case about 6 people who trusted a product and their doctors. And he goes through who the plaintiffs are. And then he talks about how the company, this is him speaking to the jurors, this company spends more money on marketing than science. He clarified the difference between 2 company names the jurors are going to be hearing, DePuy and Johnson & Johnson. And basically, DePuy is in Warsaw, Indiana, but it was purchased by Johnson & Johnson in 1999. So he's saying when you hear DePuy, it is Johnson & Johnson, a multi-billion-dollar company with a serious presence on every single continent. He showed a picture from Fixer Uppers, with Joanna Gaines, Chip and JoJo, and he talks about how when you buy a house, you need an inspection, and you, the jurors, are going to be the inspectors, and that you, the jurors, need to see all the evidence and at the end give an inspection report. And he says, I'm going to show you that Johnson & Johnson is built on a poor foundation, used shoddy equipment, making the patients the guinea pigs, and caused some bad damage among the people. He told the jurors about the past time that metal on metal hips were sold here in the U.S., that's in the 60s and 70s, and how massively and horribly metal on metal hips failed then. He told them about the next generation of the hip. It was known as the Charnley. It was created by a Dr. Charnley, and it was metal on plastic, or poly, and how, when there's friction and debris with that hip, it's poly or plastic debris, and debris is always a problem in the human body, of course, but it's not toxic like metal debris. It's not cytotoxic or cell killing. He said metal kills your cells. He said the poly or the Charnley hip, which is a metal ball with a plastic cup or a plastic chunk of cup in there, was good but not perfect. And so they started working on trying to improve the plastic. The industry did. And then in 1999, Johnson and Johnson bought DePuy. That's how you say it. It looks like Dupuy, but it's pronounced DePuy. So he contends, hey, they had to act quickly to get this metal on metal hip to market so they would get a better share of the hip device market. So they wanted to be an industry leader, and they had to work quickly to get this hip to market, which did not solve the problem that they had known about from the 60s and 70s about what metal does to tissue when it's used in a hip replacement device. He talked about a few surgeons being paid company leaders that it's their job to seduce other surgeons and convince people to use these hips, basically making them puppets of the industry. He talks about how the jurors are going to hear about what's known as the PIN study, PIN, and it basically touted that at 5 years after implantation among the people who got them, 99.9% were still in place, a clinical success rate in 99.9% of people at 5 years post-op, or 5 years after the device was implanted. He says this is a lie. And he noted and showed them the footnote to the study, which essentially it's not like was the hip a success or not. What the study actually looked at was, did the cup fall out of the bone? And that almost never happens because these were designed such that your bone would grow into it. So some background, the Pinnacle is a system. It's multi-part. There's a ball, there's a socket. The ball is put on a neck that goes down into your femur, usually in a sleeve that your bone's grown into. So there's a ball that's sitting on all that going down into the leg, and then there's the socket, which is implanted into your pelvis, which is a cup, and then there's a liner, which is in between the metal socket and the metal ball, and the liner can be metal, ceramic, or plastic, and the problems are with the metal liner, which is called the Ultamet liner. I have 2 of these. So the problem is when you move your leg, the metal ball rubs around inside the metal liner, the Ultamet liner, which is an option in the Pinnacle system. Okay, so anyway, that's the background. So Lanier goes on to say, here's the truth. They knew before they sold the product that it was bad, and they figured out how to sell it before testing it on humans in clinical trials. They used a loophole in the FDA, which does not require testing on humans. If you claim that it's a good device based on a predicate device that was tested, this is all known as 510K, which is a provision in the law that governs how devices get to market. And 510K is, in my opinion, a loophole, and it's allowing untested on humans medical products to get to market and be implanted in people like me before we really know how they're doing. So Lanier goes on to say, basically, Johnson and Johnson, experimented on people as guinea pigs, and the people didn't even know that they were the experiments. People like me, I didn't find out till later that my hip device had never been tested on humans before it was implanted in me. He says that UK records here in the US, we don't track the success of implanted devices. We don't have a national joint, or we did not have a national joint registry. but UK records showed the company that the Pinnacle early on was not doing well, a high failure rate or an unacceptable failure rate. He says Johnson & Johnson used shoddy equipment, skimped on manufacturing, knowing that harm would be caused, used failed technology, metal on metal, that we knew in the 60s and 70s it was bad. He talks about there being a few of these paid company leaders who seduced the other surgeons to use the metal on metal products. He talks about what's known as that Penn study and how it was an out and out lie, that the study says that at 5 years post-op, the Pinnacle was still in place in 99% of the patients, totally bogus. I already talked about that. He pulls out an article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which says the company used a loophole in the FDA. They're talking about this 510K provision to get the Pinnacle to market without testing it in a human body. Basically, it's an experiment on people. He showed the jurors a picture of a patient with a guinea pig on his t-shirt and says basically these people were made to be guinea pigs and nobody told them they were guinea pigs. So then the other attorney, the one representing Johnson & Johnson, his last name is Quattlebaum. So when I say Quattlebaum, that's Johnson & Johnson's representation. He comes out and is talking to the jurors, and he says, I want you to treat this as 6 separate cases. There are 6, yes, this is all one big trial, but you need to see this as 6 separate cases against Johnson & Johnson. He says we're going to talk about dates because that's very important, what we knew and when compared to when these people were implanted. He says Mark Lanier, who is the opposing attorney, the one representing the patients, the plaintiffs, Lanier's going to ask you to pass judgment, but I want you to think about what would have been reasonable for the company to have done at the time it did it. So he wants you, the jurors, to see that we, Johnson & Johnson, did the best we could with the information that we had at the time. It seemed like a good idea at the time. He goes on to say, according to the law, our responsibility ends when the device leaves our hands. When it leaves the manufacturer and goes off to the surgeons, that's what the law says. Says our responsibility ends there. He addressed the fact that the sales reps are indeed in the operating rooms just to make sure that the right product gets to the doctor. Not that they're selling their products in the OR or trying to convince the surgeons to use their products. He told the jury that the sales reps don't scrub. The nurses scrub, but get clean, but the sales reps don't because they're not actively involved in the surgery, which I don't like the idea that somebody who wasn't scrubbed is in the OR, but anyway. He talks about how each person's body is really different. He tells the jurors you have to keep that in mind. He talked about how successful the Pinnacle system is, so it's good to have all these choices with the ceramic or the poly or the metal, that it can be very helpful. He said by the time Dr. Barzell, who's one of the plaintiffs, an older gentleman who now walks with a cane, by the time he got his hip implanted, 90,000 metal-on-metal hips had been implanted, so it was a reasonable choice to implant this one plaintiff with a metal-on-metal hip. He talks about Johnson & Johnson having been in business for 110 years, that science supported the use and the safety of these metal-on-metal hips used in the Pinnacle, the metal liner. Then he puts up a slide and says, why was metal-on-metal even being considered? Why was it an option? And he talks about osteolysis. So think about, I'm not sure exactly what lysis means, maybe destroying, but osteobone. Osteolysis was a major threat. Bone can be affected when plastic debris from the metal on plastic type of hip that we had and used was shedded because of wear. So when you walk, little pieces of the softer material, the plastic, are shed, and he is going to get into that a bit more in a second. He talks about how Mr. Lanier, the plaintiff's attorney, is a marvelous storyteller. I don't think anybody would dispute that. And how he's going to try to divert the focus of the jurors to the company and away from the plaintiffs. And he talks about how well a hip surgery typically goes is like a three-legged stool. It depends on three different things: the surgical procedure itself, how the thing was implanted, the skill of the surgeon, that sort of thing. Number two, the type of device that's used. And number three, individual patient issues. So he said, this is a three-legged stool. All three legs affect how well overall the hip surgery goes. He says, wear is the enemy. That's W-E-A-R. So wear has always been the enemy of any joint replacement device, because the more you use it, the more wear, the more quickly it wears out, the more quickly you have to get a replacement or revision. He told the jury how this soft plastic cup hip, that's the one that had been the standard for a long time after we figured out metal on metal didn't work in the 60s and 70s and was hurting people. This soft plastic cup, he calls it, which it's debatable to call it soft, but he says it wasn't working out well for the really active patients. And he talked about the Charnley, that's the metal on plastic hip, which came in about 1969. Dr. Charnley only recommended his metal on plastic hip for patients who were 65 and older. And so he says that's why the company went after this younger issue, the younger people who needed hip replacements. I was 39 when I got mine. He said as of 1980, they were seeing younger people who needed hips, and they needed better bearings for those younger patients, since the Charnley was not really recommended for people who were younger than 65. He talked about synovial fluid. That means the fluid inside the joint capsule itself. It's like a raw egg white, and it lubricates the joint itself. So there's a little bit of lubrication that's like raw egg white. It's synovial fluid between the ball and the socket. He talked about osteolysis again, which is what happens when those bits of plastic are shed when a person walks or move, and it's what happens when you have a metal on plastic hip. And it doesn't come with pain, he says. So a lot of times it takes a while for anybody to figure out that the person has it. An aside here is, in the past trials, we have heard from doctors who say, yeah, but when you find osteolysis, it's pretty easy to clean out and deal with, versus when we find the debris and the damage done by metal hips, it's black in there. We find necrotic tissue. The tissue's destroyed, so it's not just picking out the foreign bodies. The muscle often is destroyed, or the tendons are gone. So how do we fix that? And I suspect we'll hear that again in this trial. Also, we've heard before doctors say, when I opened up the patient, it was like someone had poured used motor oil in there, and you're picking through dead tissue when you go in to do a revision on these metal on metal hips. And it doesn't, the plastic debris doesn't destroy heart function or brain or nerves or anything like that. So, but Mr. Quattlebaum goes on to say, representing Johnson and Johnson, the human body tolerates cobalt and chromium for up to 40 years. And I'm thinking, at what level? But anyway, he talks about unavoidable realities that all hip devices wear. All hip devices need to be revised, and there are many reasons for revisions, which is definitely true. He said there are 50,000 revision surgeries a year. And again, a revision is you take out the first total hip replacement device and you put in a new one. That's called a revision. 50,000 of those a year. So plenty of money to be made, both when you put the device in and then when you have to go back and replace it. And some people in this trial, he says, 4 out of the 6 in this particular group had a severe reaction to the metal itself, and we couldn't have foreseen that or helped that. So he says basically it's the metal and your body's reaction to it. It's not the design. And this is something that we could not have anticipated, nor did we try to anticipate it. We didn't recommend that people get tested for metal allergy before they get their hips put in place. This one's near and dear to my heart. He talks about the problems with ceramic hips. He's talking to the jury about, ceramic hips that were problematic. If they break, they shatter, and it is really hard to get the broken pieces out of the body. What happens when ceramic breaks. He brought out one of the ads that Johnson and Johnson used because it's going to be talked about a lot. It's the Coach K marketing campaign, Coach Mike Krzyzewski, His story was used to sell the Pinnacle hip. They paid him and used him in an ad or multiple ads that were directed directly to the consumer, which was kind of new at that time. It wasn't mentioned that he didn't get the metal on metal type. He got the metal on poly, and they didn't specify which one he got. But direct-to-consumer ads were very new at the time. He says that Johnson and Johnson did not preferentially push the metal on metal option of the Pinnacle over the metal on plastic or metal on ceramic types, components of the Pinnacle. He put up a slide that said, why isn't it on the market now? Well, the ASR, the ASR is a recalled device, a recalled total hip replacement device that Johnson and Johnson eventually did recall. It was metal on metal, and it was causing a lot of problems, and so they pulled it from the market. And so he says it ruined the demand for metal on metal. The fact that the ASR was recalled, nobody wanted it for a while. It tainted the whole thought of metal on metal, and so there wasn't as much demand, so we weren't selling as many, so we pulled it from the market. An aside here that was not mentioned is that the FDA, after all this started happening, the FDA started saying, look, if you want to keep selling these metal on metal products, since you didn't do any pre-market analysis, meaning studies before you started selling it on humans, studies on humans, we need you to do some post-market analysis. So you need to compile data about what these are doing, what your metal on metal hips are doing in patients, and if you want to keep selling them, submit that data to us. And that's when the company said, oh, sales are bad, we're not gonna sell them anymore. So but Quattlebaum in the trial says a prior metal on metal device tainted the market for metal on metal hips. Another aside is that the ASR was never tested on humans in clinical trials before being sold. Johnson and Johnson said, hey, the ASR is so much like the metal Pinnacle that we don't need to do the pre-market approval process. We can just let this go to market, the ASR go to market via 510K based on the fact that it's so much like the Pinnacle. The statistical equivalent is what they call it. Which leaves me asking, well then, when you decide that the ASR is dangerous and needs to be recalled, they're so much alike that we don't have to do testing on this one because it's so much like this one that just put it on the market without testing it. And when this one's awful, no, we don't need to recall this one or pull it from the market. So anyway, he goes on and talks about, Quattlebaum, representing J&J, talks about it's like the BlackBerry. Better products just come on the market. It's not that the BlackBerry was bad. It's just that something better came along. It's not that the hip was defective. Something better just came along. And I say, which is what? Oh, it's what we were using before. Something better came along. The thing that we were using before the metal on metal. Okay. He talks about the royalties and the payments to doctors that Mark Lanier addressed in his opening statements. And he says, it's just a normal thing. Everybody pays doctors, and all doctors get these kind of payments, royalties, kickbacks, etc. He kind of warns the jury that, hey, Lanier's going to try to make it seem like it's a bad thing, but everybody does this. And a lot of these payments are really small amounts. And so he showed him, for instance, a royalties chart that a doctor makes off of, let's say, 1 cup of a total hip replacement would be about an $11 kickback. And it can't be implanted by somebody in his own office, et cetera, et cetera. It has to have been sold to a patient being treated by another surgeon's office. So he says, also, one other thing to mention, did the Penn study really even affect any of these doctors' decisions to put the Pinnacle metal hip in these patients? Yes, there was marketing, but did it really, did the doctors even really look at it? And were they really influenced by it? So does it even really matter that we lied at the study? They're going to try to say that the doctors really didn't even remember reading the Penn study. So he's kind of laying out his case there. He said, also Quattlebaum said, representing J&J, the date that the hip left the manufacturer is, according to the law, the end of the company's responsibility. So that's what he wants the jurors to know. Next, so that was the end of opening arguments. Next, the plaintiff's attorney, Mark Lanier, brought a Dr. Bernstein from Hospitals for Special Surgery, which is a well-known hospital up in New York, and I think a couple of these plaintiffs got their hips done there. Excuse me. Brought him to the stand, and he basically used his questions of Bernstein to pull apart a lot of what Quattlebaum had just said in his opening statements. Lanier brought up this paper that Quattlebaum had just, been like, it's doctors, I think it was the AAOS. Okay, yeah. Quattlebaum had raised this paper and basically said, this is, from the AAOS, the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, and, it says basically the Pinnacle's a good hip. And so Lanier, while he was questioning Bernstein, got to the point and asked Bernstein, here's that same evidence, here's that paper that Quattlebaum just brought up in his opening argument saying the Pinnacle's good. Is that a peer-reviewed, randomized control study? And no, it was not at all. It's just opinions of a couple doctors. And he says, turn to the back page, and it basically says that Bernstein says, no, that's not a peer-reviewed study, meaning it had been produced not as a part of a randomized controlled study, not peer-reviewed, not real science, just a collection of opinions. Lanier with Bernstein on the stand as a witness. Together they flipped through the supplement paper, and it reads that Johnson and Johnson was a silver sponsor of that paper. And basically Lanier's pointing out that a lot of the evidence and the witnesses that the company is going to try to use to prove that these tips were okay, it's all just stuff that's paid for by the company itself. Money from the Johnson and Johnson company is behind a lot of these studies and supporting these physicians who say the Pinnacle's a good device. So we showed right off the bat that one of the papers the company tried to present as evidence that it's a good product, it's actually, and they tried to kind of imply that it was peer-reviewed, randomized clinical trial that led them to this paper. In fact, it was just sponsored content. So the company basically paid people to put it together. So then there was a break, and the judge called the attorneys up to the bench, and they had a little meeting about, I believe not in front of the jurors, about what's known as a deferred prosecution agreement. And this has come up in past trials. In early 2011, the Justice Department and Johnson and Johnson entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. It's basically a plea bargain or plea deal. The company admits it broke the law, and it paid $77 million, I think. It's called a DPA, Deferred Prosecution Agreement, and it was related to charges brought against it, or brought against Johnson and Johnson, related to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was passed and signed into law by Jimmy Carter in '77, basically to stop American companies from bribing their way into foreign countries to get favorable business positions in other countries. So we passed a law that said, hey, you can't do that. And I think it was after about 400 companies in the mid-'70s had said, yeah, if bribery's legal in that country, we need to bribe we as a country said, no, we're not going to do that. So it's a federal law, says you can't bribe people who work in other countries' governments to increase your business there. It's enforced by the SEC and the Justice Department, and basically the Department of Justice had filed charges against Johnson and Johnson regarding conspiracy and bribing doctors from the year 2002 to 2005 in Greece, Poland, and Romania, as well as the fact that they paid kickbacks to the former government of Iraq as part of the UN's Oil for Food program. And one Johnson & Johnson executive, the marketing director for DePuy at the time, arranged for payments through offshore accounts to surgeons to entice them and get them to sell DePuy's products. And he actually went to prison in 2010 for a year after pleading guilty to paying £4.5 million to Greek medical professionals in order to gain favor for their products, for Johnson & Johnson products. So it's a plea deal. the company admits guilt, promises not to do it again, and agreed to pay $77 million to settle the charges and not be prosecuted. Deferred prosecution. Incidentally, the UK also made Johnson and Johnson pay millions in pounds for the same type of bribery situations. So it doesn't look good, and Mark Lanier, of course, would want the fact that the company has admitted to and paid millions because it bribed surgeons in multiple countries. He would want that, and the plaintiffs potentially would want that admitted, showing a pattern. But in the past two Bellwether trials, it hasn't been allowed, or the jurors haven't been told about it in as great detail. And so that's what this meeting at the bench was about. On the first day of the trial, the judge told Johnson and Johnson, look, you are this close to me allowing that deferred prosecution agreement admitted as evidence in this trial. So one final thing is that at some point on this first day, Quattlebaum, Johnson and Johnson's attorney, said he would make the executives from the company available, and they haven't had to come to past trials. They have to testify, but they don't have to actually come to Dallas. But this could be the first time, because the judge said he's going to hold Quattlebaum to this. He said, you said it, you said you would make them available, and so this could be the first time that the executives have to actually testify live via a feed, a satellite feed, a secured special satellite feed, and they could be there on the stand via video in real time and, be questioned. So that's what's new in this first day of the trial, the fourth Bellwether trial. And if it helps you make decisions about what to do about your hips, that's why I'm trying to find out and let you know what's happening in this trial. I actually went up to Dallas to see what happened in court and take notes on it on Tuesday, and these are my notes. multiple pages, and that'll be what we talk about next. I'm sorry, girl. That was a lot of rambling. I'm done.
You do great.
Thank you.
Maybe
nobody wants to know this stuff, but
you've done this for a bunch of years. And, I don't think you're going to get a Taylor Swift type of audience with it.
Oh, I just want anybody who does want to know to have a way to get it. I mean, if it's the least, the doctors aren't getting it, the patients aren't getting it. Nobody knows what's happening at this trial except the people who are in the trial. And no matter how hard I tried, I could not get any of my contacts in media to send a reporter and sit there and listen. And I just don't understand why you wouldn't cover the story with thousands of people hurt. And
they will eventually cover it.
I don't know. Yeah, I forgot to mention the whole point of doing this is because 510K is still an option, and one report I read said that 90% of new medical devices that come to market are coming through 510K, which means you could be in a car crash, you could be unconscious, get taken to the ER, and
buyer beware, man.
And be implanted with a device that was never tested in human beings before it's put in you. And maybe the surgeon you get is a key opinion influencer or a paid consultant paid to promote the product, and you don't even know that. So basically, I'm trying to let people know there's a potential, and it's legal for your doctor's allegiance to be purchased. Hopefully it hasn't been, but in my case, I really have to wonder, because I got the hips after the other metal on metal hips were recalled, and somebody should have known. And I even asked, because I had read the reports and I was worried about metal on metal, and I got the emphatic, like, no, it's just this one hip. What I'm going to give you is great. And I didn't walk well for 4 years, so, and had a lot of pain. So I want 510K ended, and I want people to understand that the devices and some of the medical products aren't being tested. So be careful, because no one's going to tell you that. You're the guinea pig. I like guinea pigs.